Yeah, so that's not exactly it. This is a little bit more. So the rest is just how to scale this, right? How to scale this and some best practices. All right, so for instance, the first one is action creators. So right now, right now the way we are generating an action is that we are just doing this: dispatch and some object. That's it, right? We are just saying a dispatch, the type, and the name of the action, right? More commonly, these actions might be fairly complex, right? It won't be as trivial as just this, right? So oftentimes, what we like to be able to do is to encapsulate the complexity of generating these actions. We like to encapsulate it in a separate function, a function that knows how to generate these actions. Right? Oftentimes, these actions, we have to calculate arguments that we want to pass, additional parameters that we want to pass. Okay? Maybe we need to parse something or calculate something before we pass it along. So it would be very inconvenient to do it here. Right? So instead, right, we declare a separate function that handles that. Right? And we call those action creators. Right? They generate the action for us. Right? So for instance, it's just a regular function, right, that takes some arguments, and then it generates the JSON object. This is our JSON object. See that? It's the same thing. Right? It's the same JSON object with a type, right, the name of the action, and then it takes as arguments some optional arguments that you can have some values in there. Okay? Yes?
Why is this created in this way instead of just saying that it's a function with the name of some action creator?
It is a function.
Well, your standard function,
Function?
Yeah, like when you define a function normally, right?
Well, no, we're going to be using ES6 functions from now on. I mean, there's tons of really cool new things about it. For instance, the use of the meaning of this is now a better interpretation of what this means. Being able to parse out elements from the argument list. I mean, there's tons of great new features about ES6 that we're going to be using from now on. Okay? Yeah.
So is this just like?
It's just a regular function.
Standard practice now.
Yeah.
Write functions in this way?
Yeah, it's the new norm. Yeah. Obviously, a browser are still not supporting ES6, so typically you would transpile it like we're doing, right? These are all being transpiled down to older versions of JavaScript. Yes, which is still fine. So let's grab that. So let's create an action. So here's my component, and here's my some action creator that takes some arguments, and it's returning this object. Also, notice that there's even further simplification, right? If it's only returning that, I don't even need the return, right? I think that's it, right? Am I missing something? Some value. What is it complaining about? Some optional expressions. I'm going to assign. Am I missing something? Some syntax. Return. All right, let's leave it like that. So now that I have the action creator, we can now use the action creator in dispatch. So instead of creating the action here from within my component, I can now use the some action creator. Right? So for instance, now I can use here dispatch some action creator. Maybe give it an argument. I can give it an argument here. And pass it different arguments. So this is maybe action 1, action 2, and use it as here the value perhaps. Okay. Let's see if we broke something. Okay, still works. All right. So you would have a whole bunch of a dictionary of all the action creators and all the logic of how to create those actions. Here we have trivial actions, right? They're just doing a type, right, and some dummy value. Okay. Let's keep going. Also, these strings that we're using here, action 1, action 2, it's very common that we create constants for them. Right? So we would create constant action 1 and then the value action 1 so that they have a more high-level meaning. So we have action 2. That's also very common. So this would be action 1 and action 2. Okay, so that still should work. And 2, yep. The other best practice is that since we have all these actions hanging around, typically you would declare them in a separate file. We call it dispatch. Oh yeah, so let's move some of this. Mapping Redux dispatcher to React event handlers. Okay, yeah. Also, instead of receiving here a dispatch, okay, instead of receiving here a dispatch and using it here, more commonly, what we'd like to be able to do is say onClick and provide here an argument. Right? Instead of having to write all this, okay, ideally, we would receive it as an argument so that we don't even have to deal with the dispatcher. Right? We want to abstract that also out of here. So instead, we would pass as argument an event handler, and we would assign the onClick to that event handler. And that event handler would have the actual invocation of the dispatcher. That's also very common. So let's do that. So instead of having an event handler, we can pass here instead of the dispatcher, we can pass an event handler, and that event handler can then be assigned here as an argument. Either like that, right? If the event handler doesn't take any arguments, you can do that. Right? If the event handler takes arguments, then you still need the parentheses equal, and then pass the argument here. Some event handler. Thank you. And then action 2. And then that dispatcher that we just removed from there would need to be passed in as an argument. We would need to pass in the fact that that was a dispatcher. Right? So to do that, we would have to create a dispatch, just like we had a mapper, had a mapper that took the state, right, and mapped it to properties. Yes? Well, we also need to map any functions, any event handlers, any dispatcher, and map them also to properties. Right? Because notice now our component is taking the function as a property. Right? So we have to pass it, right, what that function is. Right? So to do that, we'll create a mapper. We'll create a mapper. Right? Just like we mapped the state, we also need to map the dispatchers. Right? So this sum event handler is what you're expecting. And what am I going to pass you? The dispatch that used to live there. Right? We took it out of the component. Right? We ripped it out. Right? And instead we put it in here. We're passing the sum creator. Right? it had the attribute, it had the value here, right? That we're going to pass as argument, right? And now we use that dispatch mapper, and just like we had used the property state to property mapper, we can now pass also the dispatch to property mapper. Okay. All right, let's see if we broke something. Okay, it still works. All right. Again, these are only things to make to do when the application starts growing. Right? When it starts growing, right, you don't want to keep everything in one single file. Right? These event handlers are going to get complex. Right? The mappings of the state is going to get complex. Right? So we need to rip them out of the component and put them in separate functions, right? And they all are going to live in separate files, right? All right, and the next would be to break up large Redux application into smaller files. All right, we'll do that next on Monday.